We'll be joining a little bit later, but I'll start because we need to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. So before I introduce today's speaker, just to let everybody know that we're recording this session. We won't record the Q&A at the end, but we will record the actual presentation of the seminar. And Dan's agreed that slides can be made available afterwards. So both the recording and the podcast and the slides will be made available on the CASE website afterwards. This is the last seminar, Social Inclusion Seminar series seminar this term. Laura and I are busy working on next term schedule. We hope to get that out early in the new year, so that you can get dates in your diary. But today I'm delighted to introduce Dan Edmiston. He's currently a CASE visiting fellow, and he was formerly a British Academy Wolfson fellow here at CASE, where he conducted research on deep poverty. He's currently a principal investigator of the WHOCOUNTS project at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And his research focuses on poverty, inequality, welfare politics, and state-citizen dynamics in high-income countries. And today he's going to be presenting some research he's been conducting with colleagues who, Dan will tell us, who are at Barcelona, called Singled Out, Changing Household Types, Poverty Risk and Welfare Effectiveness Across Europe. So Dan's going to speak for up to 25 minutes, and then there'll be 15 minutes at the end for questions. So welcome, Dan, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Abigail, and hello everyone. Sorry I can't be there in person with you, and it's good to be back at CASE. Seems I sort of pop up every couple of years. Today I'm going to be talking about a paper that's part of the WHOCOUNTS project, as Abigail mentioned, and it's a piece of work that we've been developing as part of the project, and what I'm presenting today is a paper that we've currently drafted and is under review, and I've collaborated on this with colleagues that are currently listed on the screen. Just a quick introduction to the WHOCOUNTS project. It's funded by the European Research Council. And it's a project that's really interested in some of our potential blind spots in poverty analysis and social policy research more generally, focusing in particular on different forms of hypermarginality, and particularly those groups. That's that time in the term where my voice is completely gone, sorry. So it's a project that's focusing on different forms of hypermarginality, particularly those groups that might be underserved or poorly accounted for in existing data infrastructure and social policy analysis more generally. The main focus of the project is on the non-private household population, so those groups that are very often kind of excluded, not part of the target sample of household private household income surveys, and therefore missing from official poverty statistics. So that's the main thing that we're going to be focusing on over the life of the project. But alongside it, we want to try and focus in on some of those groups that perhaps may not have received as much attention in poverty analysis and social policy research more generally. And doing so, we want to explore the potential Matthew effect and political economy of welfare, looking beyond kind of education and healthcare to look at tax and transfer systems. And more broadly, as part of the project, try to think about where in social policy research research can act as a site of exclusion or potentially reproduce hierarchies of knowledge and deservingness. So why singles? Why single people? Well, as Abigail mentioned, I was undertaking a project focusing on deep poverty in the UK. over the last few years. And single people, as part of that mixed methods project, emerge as a kind of key group at risk of not just poverty, but particularly acute forms of poverty, and also faced potentially distinctive challenges when they were living on a low income and managing their finances. And so from that finding from the UK context, we wanted to broaden it out to focus on single people living alone across Europe more generally. Now, delayed child rearing and marriage, increased childlessness, non-marriage and divorce, as well as kind of longer working lifespans and widowhood, have all altered the kind of composition of household structures across Europe over time. And in recent years, increases in living alone in Europe have principally been driven by the rise of single childless households of working age. Now, this poses a particular challenge for European welfare states, which have typically organized welfare provision and social policy around early years, child rearing, or later life stages. Now, when thinking about this, in relation to, say, kind of social investment paradigm, there's been kind of two axes of welfare access and adequacy that's been a focus in European social policy. And a great deal of research has explored how kind of varieties of welfare capitalism differ in the sort of settlement between state, market, and individual, and the degrees of defamilization that are at play. So decommodification, as I'm sure everyone is very much aware, is the kind of degree to which individuals or families can uphold a socially acceptable standard of living independently of market participation. Defamilization, by contrast, is understood as the degree to which individual adults can uphold a socially acceptable standard of living independently of family relationships, either through paid work or through social security provision. This is the definition offered by Ruth Lister, and it's the one that I kind of want to adhere to in this presentation, and one that we've tried to stick to in the paper. Now, in reality, obviously, decommodification and defamilization, the various ways in which they work, they may overlap. There may be levers that perform similar functions, distinctive levers in terms of welfare access and adequacy. That mean it's very hard empirically at times to separate out functions of decommodification and their effects. And when thinking about the outcomes of single childless households, I was particularly interested in this definition from Lister around defamilization. And when trying to look at how defamilization had been interpreted in the kind of European social policy literature, it became clear that there was some inconsistency in how defamilization was being conceptualized, operationalized, and measured. So there are others, but there were kind of three key ways in which defamilization seems to be kind of understood and operationalized in welfare state analysis. So the first is defamilization, meaning kind of the decommodification of family life. So through services, taxes and transfers, benefits in kind, decommodification of family life ultimately determines people's ability to have and do family. So the various ways in which the welfare state resources people's capacity to raise children, care for family members. The second way in which defamiliation has been understood is the extent to which welfare states and welfare state regimes facilitate female autonomy specifically and economic independence from the family. So there's been a really rich body of literature that's explored the kind of gendered nature of welfare state transformation and what that means for female autonomy and gender equality. And then the third way in which defamiliation has been understood is focusing on female labour market participation, general inequality, but particularly focusing on people's capacity to reconcile paid and unpaid care work. Now, of course, all of these kind of three different ways of understanding defamiliation can overlap. And as I was saying about the distinction between decommodification and defamiliation, likewise, policy levers may actually attempt to achieve defamiliation in all of these various ways in which you might interpret it. So defamiliation has been principally understood in these ways in the existing literature. And this means that the capacity to have and do family is often understood as something that is mediated by social security and anti-poverty policy. And this is despite the fact that the redistributive functions of welfare states are considerably shaped by the presence, size, and structure of family across household types. Not related to single childless households specifically, but reflecting on the heteronormativity of social policy as a kind of discipline and applied field, Lee Gregory and Peter Matthews argue that the family as a core basis for welfare in societies has meant that reflexively the base unit of analysis within social policy has been the heterosexual family, without always sufficient broader consideration of the implications for different groups. In this case, for the piece of work we're focusing on single childless households. And if the family has been the kind of default base unit of analysis in social policy, what does this mean for those who do not satisfy the condition of having and doing family, when this seems to be a kind of very often a necessary precondition to certain forms and levels of welfare? Karen Hughes and Anna Tarrant, argue that it can actually result in the discursive and evidentiary absenting of key groups on the social and economic margins. So exploring the trajectories of men experiencing place-based hardship, they demonstrate how previously partnered single men principally become an object of social inquiry or policy attention as so-called absent fathers or via family participation. Independently of family relationships, their poverty is very often overlooked or neglected. Now, extending this argument further, we can then think of poverty research as producing both visibility and potential erasure, often in ways that codify deserving and undeserving distinctions amongst the general public. So, for example, when the experiences of families or children in poverty are centered and circulated over other household types, this invariably shapes academic and public understanding of poverty, including who is most at risk of it. And a consequence is that single working age adults have tended not to be considered a priority group as an object of policy consideration and attention. And this is despite the fact there's considerable evidence to suggest that they are quite at risk. So they're very heavily overrepresented amongst the homeless population, in temporary accommodation, and have been described previously as the kind of silent missing poor. Suzanne Fitzpatrick and Glenn Bramley and colleagues have, through their, not just through the destitution work with Joseph Rowntree Foundation, but through a lot of their other projects as well, find that single working age adults are a group that are very much at risk. So, for example, in the destitution work that they've done with JRF, they find that single working age adults are 3.5 times more likely to experience destitution compared with their share in the UK population. Now, beyond kind of disproportionate risk to more intense forms of poverty, there's also evidence that single childless adults have been some of the biggest losers to welfare state recalibration in recent years. So Varner and colleagues find that unemployed singles now face kind of heightened poverty risk, and particularly deep poverty risk. In Sweden, there's evidence to suggest that single working age people have been disproportionately affected by cuts to unemployment benefits over time. Gornick and colleagues find that tax and transfers are more effective at poverty reduction amongst non-disabled adults with children. There's also some work looking at how kind of changes in the demographic composition of countries across Europe is affecting overall poverty rates. So Mariani finds that demographic shifts, including household changes in household structures, contribute towards shifts in overall poverty rates and trends in Belgium. Sorry for the typo. And then Azzolini and colleagues find that demographic changes actually have mixed effects on poverty rates, depending on the country. So they reduce it considerably in countries like Germany, Italy and Spain, modestly in places like Denmark, and they actually increase it in other countries like Norway. So there's not a kind of clear story, it seems to be told by looking exclusively at kind of demographic shifts. So there is evidence out there that gives some clue as to what might be happening to single childless working age households. Some of this work has looked at kind of share rates or poverty reduction. And some of it has looked at a single country, but there's been much less focus on kind of deeper forms of poverty or cross-country comparisons, and particularly looking at changes in the kind of rates and share of poverty and the effectiveness of tax and transfer systems. So given that, we had kind of two main research questions for this paper. So what has been the kind of prevalence and risk of poverty across different household types in Europe in recent years? What impact have taxes and transfers had on reducing poverty risk across different household types? A little bit on our data, variables and methods. So we focused on a 15-year period using EU Silk. So we pulled data from three waves, so 2007, 2013 and 2019, covering 25 European countries subject to various issues around availability of data. These waves were chosen given EU6 rotating panel design. And for our sample, we had almost 250,000 households, working age households, so where the oldest household member was aged between 20 and 59. And we had two key dependent variables. So avoiding relative poverty after taxes and transfers, so using the 60% of median, and then avoiding deep poverty after taxes and transfers as well. And for that, we used the 40% of the median poverty line. We're particularly keen to incorporate a deep poverty measure despite challenges around data quality, given evidence to suggest that single childless households of working age were not only likely to experience poverty, but more acute forms of poverty as well. In terms of our micro variables, we were interested, obviously, in household composition. So we looked at single adults without children, single with children, so lone parents, couples without children, couples with 1 to 2 children, and then couples with 3 or more children. We had a measure of employment intensity, an indicator about whether at least one adult in the household reported disability-related benefits. And then we had we had a series of controls around age, education, home ownership, birthplace, measure of inequality, unemployment rate, social expenditure to kind of capture welfare effort. And then we had 2 macro variables, which really keen to receive any feedback people might have on these, as well as everything else, obviously. So the first was a familisation index, and through this we wanted to kind of get at some of those measures of defamiliation that have been more commonly applied in European social policy analysis. So the capacity to have and do family, decommodifying family life, enabling people to reconcile paid work with cared work. And we drew on OECD data for this. So it was the total cost of services and transfers directed to childcare and education, plus maternity and paternity benefits as a percentage of GDP. And then we had a measure of defamilization. So this was the replacement rate for unemployed people, the net replacement rate calculated for different household types, and looking at the kind of relative difference between them. Now, through this measure, as imperfect as it is, what we were really keen to try and get at is the kind of relative generosity of taxes and tax and transfer systems for providing wage replacement independently of you having family. And then finally, in terms of our method, so for the paper, we descriptively outline poverty in Europe by country, wave, and our main variables, and then to investigate how household type relates to avoiding poverty after taxes and transfers. We then estimated a series of multi-level linear regression models with a 3-level random effect specification. And given the hierarchical structure of the data, working age household respondents level 1 were nested within country waves level 2, which were then in turn nested within countries at level 3. And this structure reflected the time series, cross-sectional nature of the data, with countries observed across multiple survey waves. And to account for cross-sectional and longitudinal variation in our macro level variables, we included these in the models in two forms, so the between component and the within component. In addition to this, two specific wave-specific fixed effect dummies were included to control for period-specific shocks. And then we estimated linear probability models rather than logistic to make it easier to interpret the results. Okay, so what did we find? Well, first, before we kind of go into looking at what happened to poverty rates and the overall composition of poverty over the time period of interest, I guess it's worth just highlighting changes in the overall composition of households during this period. So between 2007 and 2019, single childless households grew steadily by around 12%, making up a third of all working age households, the second most common household type by 2019. Just a little bit behind couple households with 1 to 2 children. Overall, couple households with 1 to 2 children and couple households with 3 or more children contracted slightly by 6% and 12% respectively over the same period. So we see important change in a relatively short time period. We see changes in the kind of overall composition of households. Over this time period, what did we see in terms of the incidence of relative poverty? So overall, single member households experienced the highest percentage point increase in the instance of relative and deep poverty, primarily in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And between 2007 and 2009, relative poverty increased by 8% for single child households and by 14% for couple childless households. Alongside this, so I mean, from this, one of the things that clearly jumps out and is the reason why so much work is rightly focused on lone parents, single adults living with children. We see really elevated relative poverty rates compared to other groups. And one of the things that we wanted to do in the paper is to think about, well, what does this mean for the kind of the overall share of what does this mean for kind of the overall composition of who's in poverty as well? So here you can see the share of households by household type for all those in relative poverty, and you can see here. So for single childless households in the dark navy blue, you see this household type making up an increasing share of those in relative poverty. Those single households with children, so lone parents, hover around the same amount. We don't see much change. We see a slight reduction in the contribution of families for shorthand, sort of couples with any children, their overall contribution to the relative poverty share. When we look at deeper forms of poverty, sorry, I can't remember if I said this. So this is for all of the countries that we looked at. For deep poverty incidents, we see kind kind of similar patterns, with lone parents being very much having very elevated levels of deep poverty, followed by single childless households. And we see kind of steady increases in the incidence of deep poverty for single childless households, and a jump also for lone parents. When we look at what this means for the overall kind of deep poverty share, we can see that single childless households make up a growing share of those in deep poverty, rising from around 42% of everyone in deep poverty of working age population to 47%. Now, when we look at this is a very bad figure, so I'm sorry, all the charts. What I wanted to show here, I'm just focusing on in the paper we report these trends by country for deep poverty as well, but in the interest of time, I just want to focus on relative poverty here. And you can see across the countries that we looked at, there's considerable variation in terms of how much tax and transfer systems reduce relative poverty. So the percentage point reduction in relative poverty that arises as a result of taxes and transfers. And you can see also that welfare regime types are not always performing as we might expect them to do. Often there's as much variation within kind of ideal welfare regime types as there is between welfare regime types. But just to highlight a couple of things, so to some extent liberal welfare regimes are behaving as expected, maybe. So lone parents or elevated poverty rates seem to be most effective, but single people are losing out. In Southern European welfare regimes such as Spain, Portugal, and Italy, it's not really behaving as expected. There's not as much variation as we might expect between single childless households and other household types. And then in kind of more social democratic welfare regimes like Sweden and Denmark, we can see that single childless households, sorry, I didn't explain this, it's the S, single childless households is the S. We can see that in these contexts where there's perhaps better welfare adequacy and coverage, they are single households are doing relatively better. But across the board, we see a pattern when we look over time, and this is a better kind of illustrated in the paper. We see a pattern of kind of declining welfare effectiveness for single childless households. And given the kind of limited time points that we had, we only had 3 time points, we can't be conclusive, but from the kind of models that we did, we found evidence of declining welfare effectiveness more generally. So not just for single childless households, but more generally over the period studied. So to look at our models then. So we conducted the analysis in 4 steps for both of our poverty indicators separately. So for relative poverty here in blue, and for deep poverty in red, where there's a model 2 or a model number and then a model number D. The model number D refers to deep poverty. So So first, we wanted to examine the association between poverty after taxes and transfers and household type, controlling for socio-demographic and contextual variables. And our results showed that relative to their poverty risk, single, childless, working age households were the kind of, so they're the reference category here. So think of them as the line. They were the least likely to be lifted out of either relative poverty or deep poverty. So whilst social policy research and policymakers have rightly emphasised the kind of heightened poverty risk amongst lone parent households, tax transfer systems appear considerably more effective at lifting them out of poverty compared to other household types. Their predicted probability of avoiding poverty is around 10% higher than that of single childless households. Similarly, couples with children are generally more likely to be protected from relative poverty, although to a lesser extent than lone parent households. And in the case of deep poverty, in this model, tax and transfers seem to operate with similar kind of effectiveness, where lone parent and larger family households avoid poverty at a higher rate than other household types. Now, work intensity here, so across all working age households, greater labour market attachment increased the predicted probability of avoiding relative poverty, but is much less certain for avoiding deep poverty, and even becomes negative. And be really keen to hear people's thoughts on this. We thought it may reflect kind of measurement error when examining deep income poverty, but it could equally kind of reflect compositional differences, where those in deep poverty are more likely to be self-employed, less likely to receive family or child or housing allowances that could lift them out of deep poverty. And equally, the results may suggest kind of poorly designed taper rates or cliff edges, where increased but insufficient labour market attachment triggers a loss in certain income protections. And finally, with disability receipt, model 2 shows that the predicted probability of avoiding deep poverty is 21% higher for households who receive disability-related benefits, and 29% in the case of avoiding relative poverty. Okay, so second, we wanted to test kind of separate micro-level interactions between household type and household labour market attachment and household disability status, respectively. So model 3 here adds an interaction between household type and labour market attachment, and it shows that the kind of the effect of labour market integration differs between relative and deep poverty alleviation and across household type. So in the case of relative poverty, higher labour market attachment significantly enhances welfare effectiveness, much more so for households with children, especially larger families. And similar trends are observed for avoiding deep poverty. For model 4, the results show that receipt of disability benefits is one of the kind of most important mechanisms through which tax transfer systems improve welfare effectiveness, particularly amongst single childless households. And by comparison, for lone parent households and larger family households, disability benefits are less effective in lifting them out of poverty after taxes and transfers. And this is particularly true for larger families, who are almost 14% less likely to avoid poverty. Lastly, we examined whether kind of macro contextual factors affected the association between household type and avoiding poverty after taxes and transfers through some cross-level interactions. So in model 6 here, we can see that there's substantial heterogeneity across household types, indicating that the redistributive capacity of such policies is pretty conditional on family composition, as we might expect. And for both relative and deep poverty, the average main effect of familisation refers to single child households, obviously. And among this group, neither the between country nor the within country component are significantly associated with poverty alleviation. And by contrast, households with children more substantially benefit from familisation, both in its between and within country components. So for relative poverty, higher levels of familisation are associated with a significantly higher probability of avoiding poverty in lone parents and larger family households. And these effects are even stronger for when we look at the impact of greater familisation on deep poverty avoidance. When it comes to defamiliation, so understood as the extent to which social security systems allow people to live independently of family relationships in the way that Ruth Lister defined it, the results from Model 8 indicate a positive association between defamiliation and poverty alleviation for single childless households. And this effect is driven by the between country component, relative poverty, suggesting that in countries with more individualized and generous income protection, tax transfer systems are more effective at poverty alleviation for this group, in much the same way as we might expect. Oh dear, I'm just in the time. Okay, so very, very quickly then. So from this study, we found that single person households seem to be the fastest growing household type and have seen the sharpest increase in relative and deep poverty since the 2007-2008 financial crisis. They constitute a growing share of people living on a low income and face limited and uneven access to welfare, especially when no disability disability benefits are being received. Tax and transfer systems seem to work better for households with children and stronger labour market attachment, highlighting the kind of central role of work and family in mediating access to welfare. And one of the things that we're really keen to do once this paper has been fully developed is to go further with it. So explore what poverty means for single childless households. Is there the potential for a single poverty premium given economies of scale that are very often present within a household? Are kind of needs and resources comparable across household types? What happens to kind of correspondence between needs and resources when we look at different household types controlling for sociodemographic factors? And then thinking particularly about how poverty measures are able to capture some of these differences, particularly given that single childless households seem to be very much overrepresented in the very bottom of the low income distribution. I'll stop there because Abigail, you said 45 minutes, and I wanted to give time for comments and feedback. I would really appreciate people's ideas and questions for how we can